Today I'm going to talk about sphagnum farming, which is quite new. It's a very new project here, and in fact it's the only sphagnum farming project in the UK at the moment, so we're treading new ground here. And sphagnum farming is a form of paludiculture. So because the sphagnum farming project is actually in its infancy at the moment, I'm going to talk quite a bit more about the background to it and why it's necessary before I come and talk about the project itself. So paludiculture, productive use of wet peatlands, so we're talking about farming here. And you can grow a range of perennial plants such as reeds, trees and grasses for biomass, building materials, fodder, sphagnum as a peat replacement, which I'm going to talk about later, and then things like edible or medicinal plants such as wild rice or sundews. A few pictures of things here. So why is paludiculture important, may become important in the future? Well, climate change mitigation, which we've talked a lot about this morning. So similar reasons really as for peatland rewetting and restoration for conservation. Peatlands are the UK's largest terrestrial carbon store, because when wetland plants die, they don't decompose in the anaerobic conditions, but they store the carbon that was absorbed while they were growing. And undamaged peatlands can actually sequester or store away around about 4 tonnes of carbon greenhouse gases per hectare per year, which is figures from Natural England. Peat formation is possible with paludiculture, so we reduce the amount of carbon store losses that currently occur in drained agricultural land. As you can see in the bottom left picture here, there's some cows grazing on a drained grassland in Germany, and of course the cows add to the greenhouse gas emissions through methane as well. Also with rewetting peatlands, peatlands are like a sponge, so if you drain the water out, they sink. The picture in the top right here is one of the famous home fen moss posts. The top of the post was actually at the ground level 150 years ago, and so the ground around it has sunk by 4 metres, and that's through drainage of an adjacent mere. And reducing land levels, draining peatlands results in flooding, as you can see from the Somerset levels, flooding in 2014. All this is very expensive to mitigate, clean up. It's also expensive to drain land, so paludiculture would reduce costs as well. There are other reasons as well, of course. Increasing carbon storage, as I've already said, through peat accumulation that's stored through plant photosynthesis, and then you've got slow decomposition through anaerobic conditions. A good reason, of course, is an increase in biodiversity, which would provide more wetland habitat for rare and specialised and marginalised plants and animals. And there would also be an increase in employment and economic returns in areas that have peatlands, by bringing some areas into agricultural use rather than low value pasture, and making some difficult to farm land, such as land that's subject to flooding at the moment, economically viable. There are benefits for conservation areas, of course. Here's our Caddysen little woolden moss, surrounded by a matrix of agricultural fields which are drained and dry. So it would be much better supported if it was surrounded by land that was wet, low nutrient, and sort of near natural lag fen with some kinds of paludiculture, or more complementary to have sphagnum farming areas around there, in terms of the hydrological control and an increase in the habitat area for mossland species. Dave Crawshaw talked earlier about wildlife corridors, and here's the same picture from the Lawton report. But obviously, having areas of paludiculture in between and around our mossland areas or to provide links between the reserves to support species movement and resilience, in line with the DEFRA report, Making Space for Nature. There'd also be a revenue from the crop, of course, which would further conservation efforts and potentially attract some funding through future carbon offset schemes. There are some barriers to paludiculture, of course. It looks weird. There are new concepts, there's no drainage, the change of crop, new markets to be explored, and all this for farming practices could be difficult. Culturally, the landscape could look very different. At the moment we have large areas, large fields with drainage, animals on them. It would look very different as a full wetland area. And there are mechanical adaptations, of course, as well. This ridiculous arm on this machine here is for harvesting sphagnum, and this is in a trial field in Germany, in Lower Saxony. So because peatlands are wet and spongy, you need particular low-impact tracked vehicles for boggy ground and long-reach harvesting machines, as in this one. There are some uncertainties. The level of methane released through re-wetting might be more than drainage ditches. We don't quite know that yet, but it depends on the crop that's grown. And also subsidies are currently given for drainage-based agriculture, but not currently for paludiculture. So the benefits of paludiculture just need to be more widely known about and accepted. So coming on to sphagnum farming, well, peatlands and mosslands have high conservation value. As we know, sphagnum-dominated lowland bogs are scarce in the UK, and the EU Habitats Directive identifies peat bogs as highly endangered and highly valued. So sphagnum farming would extend the mossland areas and create further habitat. Flood management is important, of course, as I've already mentioned. So the restoration of water regulation systems in peatlands in lowland areas is perhaps more so in sphagnum farming than in other forms of paludiculture, because water moves very slowly through sphagnum. Sphagnum farming could potentially reduce the methane loss through wetted peatlands, because sphagnum does act as a methane filter, although research is ongoing on that. And sphagnum farming could reduce damage elsewhere. Sphagnum is currently used in horticulture for orchid growing, for use in vivarium, and currently that's stripped from the wild in sources abroad, which may or may not be done sustainably. Sphagnum is potentially a good peat alternative, either singly or more likely with other renewable materials. It's an excellent growing media on its own and with other materials. As you can see, these poinsettias, which are in a large trial in Holland. Sphagnum has high storage capacity for water, of course, and for air. It's got a low weight per volume. It has antibacterial, antifungal properties. Most peat is actually semi-decomposed sphagnum, but peat, as we know, is running out, and there are forthcoming restrictions on its use. DEFRA is working to phase out the use of peat-based products in the UK by 2020 for amateur gardeners and 2030 for professional horticulture. But actually more than 2 million cubic metres of peat was used in 2015 in the UK garden industry, so that's a lot really to have a replacement for. Peat harvesting isn't renewable, of course, but sphagnum farming may be, because it probably will have rotational cropping. The growing media industry and the horticultural industry have high levels of employment and high demand for peat, so we do need to get on with peat replacement. The replacements that are around at the moment are not all that great. The sphagnum materials we'll be using are micropropagated materials by a company called Moss, and there's their web link there if you want to have a look at that at some point. So the sphagnum is tissue cultured in sterile conditions from very small amounts, which can be locally sourced, as provenance is quite often an issue. The two materials of theirs that we'll be using for the sphagnum farming trial are beader gel and beader hummock. Beader gel is short strands of sphagnum floating in a hydrocolloidal gel, and that helps the peat to adhere to the surface and makes it easy to spread around. And beader hummock, which is beader gel that's sprayed into plug plants to make a plug plant, which are then put into the ground just like a plug plant is, but obviously you need an army of people to do that, although mechanical methods are being explored at the moment. So why do we need to use sphagnum, micropropagated sphagnum? Well, there are two main reasons really. There's a lack of source material in the UK. Most sphagnum is now found in priority habitat conservation areas, which are protected under the EU Habitats Directive, which we can't just go clawing off. And sphagnum is normally slow to establish and grow, but with micropropagation it can be produced en masse pretty rapidly. It's clean, there's no risk of pathogens or weed introduction. We have plenty of evidence that it actually works. It's already being used successfully in various forms to re-establish sphagnum in the uplands and some trials in the lowlands. Plug planting for blanket bog restoration in the South Pennines and the Yorkshire has become actually the world's largest sphagnum restoration effort. And the numbers are there. 1.2 million beader hummock has been put on 360 hectares of blanket bog by the Moors for the Future partnership. So coming on to the Sphagnum Farming UK project, I've nearly finished. It's, as I say, it's the first project of its kind in the UK, and it's a partnership approach again. As with the Carbon Landscape Partnership, we have landowners, regulators, compost manufacturers, growers and academics all coming together to address the broad range commercial and regulatory needs for the resulting product. The scope of the trial, it's currently a 15-month trial with a range of sphagnum species and watering regimes, monitoring growth and greenhouse gases to assess the carbon budget and to inform larger trials. So this is a pilot study, but we anticipate that there'll be further funding to continue the work at the end of the trial. The areas, locally we have an area on Little Walden Moss, cut over peatland obviously, and we have some acid grassland field sites elsewhere in the UK. The eventual overall aims are to produce a blueprint for sphagnum farming. So to outline the principles and practicalities for an environmentally sustainable farming system on peatlands using sphagnum. And also we hope that this will inform policy through DEFRA and through the agricultural and horticultural industries to progress a transition to a sustainable growing media within UK horticulture. And there's loads of references. Okay, thank you very much.